Defending Darwin, Essays on Evolution, written by Thomas H. Huxley, narrated by Bernard Faricy. Huxley on the Origin of Species. There is a growing immensity in the speculations of science to which no human thing or thought at this day is comparable. Apart from the results which science brings us home and securely harvests, there is an expansive force and latitude in its tentative efforts, which lifts us out of ourselves and transfigures our mortality. We may have a preference for moral themes like the Homeric sage, who had seen and known much, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments. Yet we must end by confession that the windy ways of men are but dust which rises up and is lightly laid again, in comparison with the work of nature, to which science testifies, but which has no boundaries in time or space to which science can approximate. There is something altogether out of reach of science, and yet the compass of science is practically illimitable. Hence it is that from time to time we are startled and perplexed by theories which have no parallel in the contracted moral world. For the generalizations of science sweep on in ever-widening circles and more aspiring flights through a limitless creation. While astronomy, with its telescope, ranges beyond the known stars, and physiology, with its microscope, is subdividing infinite minutiae, we may expect that our historic centuries may be treated as inadequate counters in the history of the planet on which we are placed. We must expect new conceptions of the nature and relations of its denizens, as science acquires the materials for fresh generalizations. Nor have we occasion for alarms if a highly advanced knowledge like that of the eminent naturalist before us confronts us with an hypothesis as vast as it is novel. This hypothesis may or may not be sustainable hereafter. It may give way to something else, and higher science may reverse what science has here built up with so much skill and patience. But its sufficiency must be tried by the tests of science alone, if we are to maintain our position as the heirs of Bacon and the acquitters of Galileo. We must weigh this hypothesis strictly in the controversy which is coming, by the only tests which are appropriate and by no others whatsoever. The hypothesis to which we point, and of which the present work of Mr. Darwin is but the preliminary outline, may be stated in his own language as follows. Species originated by means of natural selection or through the preservation of the favoured races in the struggle for life. To render this thesis intelligible, it is necessary to interpret its terms. In the first place, what is a species? The question is a simple one, but the right answer to it is hard to find, even if we appeal to those who should know most about it. It is all those animals or plants which have descended from a single pair of parents. It is the smallest distinctly definable group of living organisms. It is an eternal and immutable entity. It is a mere abstraction of the human intellect having no existence in nature. Such are a few of the significations attached to this simple word, which may be culled from authoritative sources, and if, leaving terms and theoretical subtleties aside, we turn to facts and endeavour to gather a meaning for ourselves by studying the things to which in practice the name of species is applied, it profits us little, for practice varies as much as theory. Let the botanist or the zoologist examine and describe the productions of a country, and one will pretty certainly disagree with the other as to the number, limits, and definitions of the species into which he groups the very same things. In these islands we are in the habit of regarding mankind as of one species, but a fortnight's steam will land us in a country where divines and savants, for once in agreement, vie with one another in loudness of assertion, if not in cogency of proof, that men are of different species, and more particularly that the species Negro is so distinct from our own that the 10 Commandments have actually no reference to him. Even in the calm region of entomology, where, if anywhere in this sinful world, passion and prejudice should fail to stir the mind, One learned coleopterist will fill 10 attractive volumes with description of species of beetles, 9/10 of which are immediately declared by his brother beetlemongers to be no species at all. The truth is that the number of distinguishable living creatures almost surpasses imagination. At least 100,000 such kinds of insects alone have been described and may be identified in collections, and the number of separable kinds of living things is underestimated at 500,000. Seeing that most of these obvious kinds have their accidental varieties, and that they often shade into others by imperceptible degrees, it may well be imagined that the task of distinguishing between what is permanent and what fleeting, what is a species and what a mere variety, is sufficiently formidable. But is it not possible to apply a test whereby a true species may be known from a mere variety? Is there no criterion of species? Great authorities affirm that there is, that the unions of members of the same species are always fertile, while those of distinct species are either sterile or their offspring, called hybrids, are so. It is affirmed not only that this is an experimental fact, but that it is a provision for the preservation of the purity of species. Such a criterion as this would be invaluable, but, unfortunately, not only is it not obvious how to apply it in the great majority of cases in which its aid is needed, but its general validity is stoutly denied. The Honourable and Reverend Mr. Herbert, a most trustworthy authority, not only asserts as the result of his own observation and experiments that many hybrids are quite as fertile as the parent species, but he goes so far as to assert that the particular plant Crinum capense is much more fertile when crossed by a distinct species than when fertilized by its proper pollen. On the other hand, the famous Gärtner, though he took the greatest pains to cross the primrose and the cowslip, succeeded only once or twice in several years, and yet it is a well-established fact that the primrose and the cowslip are only varieties of the same kind of plant. Again, such cases as the following are well established. The female of species A, if crossed with the male of species B, is fertile, but if the female of B is crossed with the male of A, she remains barren. Facts of this kind destroy the value of the supposed criterion. If, weary of the endless difficulties involved in the determination of species, the investigator, contenting himself with the rough practical distinction of separable kinds, endeavours to study them as they occur in nature, to ascertain their relations to the conditions which surround them, their mutual harmonies, discordances of structure, the bond of union of their parts and their past history, he finds himself, according to the received notions, in a mighty maze, and with at most the dimmest adumbration of a plan. If he starts with any one clear conviction, it is that every part of a living creature is cunningly adapted to some special use in its life. Has not his Paley told him that that seemingly useless organ, the spleen, is beautifully adjusted as so much packing between the other organs? And yet, at the outset of his studies, he finds that no adaptive reason whatsoever can be given for one half of the peculiarities of vegetable structure. He also discovers rudimentary teeth which are never used in the gums of the young calf and in those of the fetal whale. Insects which never bite have rudimental jaws, and others which never fly have rudimental wings. Naturally blind creatures have rudimental eyes, and the halt have rudimentary limbs. So again, no animal or plant puts on its perfect form at once, but all have to start from the same point, however various the course which each has to pursue. Not only men and horses, and cats and dogs, lobsters and beetles, periwinkles and mussels, but even the very sponges and animalcules commence their existence under forms which are essentially undistinguishable, and this is true of all the infinite variety of plants. Nay, more, all living beings march side by side along the high road of development, and separate the later the more like they are, like people leaving church, who all go down the aisle, but having reached the door, some turn into the parsonage, others go down the village, and others part only in the next parish. A man in his development runs for a little while parallel with, though never passing through, the form of the meanest worm, then travels for a space beside the fish, then journeys along with the bird and the reptile for his fellow travellers, and only at last, after a brief companionship with the highest of the four-footed and the four-handed world, rises into the dignity of pure manhood. No competent thinker of the present day dreams of explaining these indubitable facts by the notion of the existence of unknown and undiscoverable adaptations to purpose, and we will remind those who, ignorant of the facts, must be moved by authority, that no one has asserted the incompetence of the doctrine of final causes in its application to physiology and anatomy more strongly than our own eminent anatomist Professor Owen, who, speaking of such cases, says, on the nature of limbs, pages 39-40, "I think it will be obvious that the principle of final adaptation fails to satisfy all the conditions of the problem. But if the doctrine of final causes will not help us to comprehend the anomalies of living structure, the principle of adaptation must surely lead us to understand why certain living beings are found in certain regions of the world and not in others. The palm, as we know it, will not grow in our climate, nor the oak in Greenland. The white bear cannot live where the tiger thrives, nor vice versa. And the more the natural habits of animal and vegetable species are examined, the more do they seem on the whole limited to particular provinces. But when we look into the facts established by the study of the geographical distribution of animals and plants, it seems utterly hopeless to attempt to understand the strange and apparently capricious relations which they exhibit. One would be inclined to suppose a priori that every country must be naturally peopled by those animals that are fittest to live and thrive in it. And yet how, on this hypothesis, are we to account for the absence of cattle in the pampas of South America, when those parts of the New World were discovered? It is not that they were unfit for cattle, for millions of cattle now run wild there, and the like holds good of Australia and New Zealand. It is a curious circumstance, in fact, that the animals and plants of the northern hemisphere are not only as well adapted to live in the southern hemisphere as its own autochthones, but are in many cases absolutely better adapted, and so overrun and extirpate the aborigines. Clearly, therefore, the species which naturally inhabit a country are not necessarily the best adapted to its climate and other conditions. The inhabitants of islands are often distinct from any other known species of animal or plants. Witness our recent examples from the work of Sir Emerson Tennant on Ceylon. And yet they have almost always a sort of general family resemblance to the animals and plants of the nearest mainland. On the other hand, there is hardly a species of fish, shell, or crab common to the opposite sides of the narrow isthmus of Panama. Wherever we look, then, living nature offers us riddles of difficult solution, if we suppose that what we see is all that can be known of it. But our knowledge of life is not confined to the existing world. Whatever their minor differences, geologists are agreed as to the vast thickness of the accumulated strata which compose the visible part of our earth, and the inconceivable immensity of the time of whose lapse they are the imperfect, but the only accessible witnesses. Now, throughout the greater part of this long series of stratified rocks are scattered, sometimes very abundantly, multitudes of organic remains, the fossilized exuviae of animals and plants which lived and died while the mud of which the rocks are formed was yet soft, ooze, and could receive and bury them. It would be a great error to suppose that these organic remains were fragmentary relics. Our museums exhibit fossil shells of immeasurable antiquity, as perfect as the day they were formed, whole skeletons without a limb disturbed, nay, the changed flesh, the developing embryos, and even the very footsteps of primeval organisms. Thus the naturalist finds in the bowels of the earth species as well defined as, and in some groups of animals more numerous than, those that breathe the upper air. But, singularly enough, the majority of these entombed species are wholly distinct from those that now live, nor is this unlikeness without its rule and order. As a broad fact, the further we go back in time, the less the buried species are like existing forms, and the further apart the sets of extinct creatures are, the less they are like one another. In other words, there has been a regular succession of living beings, each younger set being, in a very broad and general sense, somewhat more like those which now live. It was once supposed that this succession had been the result of vast successive catastrophes, destructions and recreations en masse, but catastrophes are now almost eliminated from geological, or at least paleontological speculation, and it is admitted on all hands that the seeming breaks in the chain of being are not absolute, but only relative to our imperfect knowledge, that species have replaced species not in assemblages, but one by one, and that, if it were possible to have all the phenomena of the past presented to us, the convenient epochs and formations of the geologist, though having a certain distinctness, would fade into one another with limits as undefinable as those of the distinct and yet separable colours of the solar spectrum. Such is a brief summary of the main truths which have been established concerning species. Are these truths ultimate and irresolvable facts, or are their complexities and perplexities the mere expressions of a higher law? A large number of persons practically assume the former position to be correct. They believe that the writer of the Pentateuch was empowered and commissioned to teach us scientific as well as other truth, that the account we find there of the creation of living things is simply and literally correct, and that anything which seems to contradict it is, by the nature of the case, false. All the phenomena which have been detailed are, on this view, the immediate product of a creative fiat, and consequently are out of the domain of science altogether. Whether this view prove ultimately to be true or false, it is, at any rate, not at present supported by what is commonly regarded as logical proof, even if it be capable of discussion by reason, and hence we consider ourselves at liberty to pass it by and to turn to those views which profess to rest on a scientific basis only, and therefore admit of being argued to their consequences. And we do this with the less hesitation, it so happens, that those persons who are practically conversant with the facts of the case, plainly a considerable advantage, have always thought fit to range themselves under the latter category. The majority of these competent persons have up to the present time maintained two positions. The first, that every species is, within certain defined or definable limits, fixed and incapable of modification. The second, that every species was originally produced by a distinct creative act. The second position is obviously incapable of proof or disproof, the direct operations of the Creator not being subjects of science, and it must therefore be regarded as a corollary from the first, the truth or falsehood of which is a matter of evidence. Most persons imagine that the arguments in favour of it are overwhelming, but to some few minds, and these, it must be confessed, intellects of no small power and grasp of knowledge, they have not brought conviction. Among these minds, that of the famous naturalist Lamarck, who possessed a greater acquaintance with the lower forms of life than any man of his day, Cuvier not excepted, and was a good botanist to boot, occupies a prominent place. Two facts appear to have strongly affected the course of thought of this remarkable man. The one, that finer or stronger links of affinity connect all living beings with one another, and that thus the highest creatures grades by multitudinous steps into the lowest. The other, that an organ may be developed in particular directions by exerting itself in particular ways, and that modifications once induced may be transmitted and become hereditary. Putting these facts together, Lamarck endeavoured to account for the first by the operation of the second. Place an animal in new circumstances, says he, and its needs will be altered. The new needs will create new desires, and the attempt to gratify such desires will result in an appropriate modification of the organs exerted. Make a man a blacksmith, and his brachial muscles will develop in accordance with the demands made upon them. And in like manner, says Lamarck, the efforts of some short-necked bird to catch fish without wetting himself have with time and perseverance given rise to all our herons and long-necked waders. The Lamarckian hypothesis has long been since justly condemned, and it is the established practice for every tyro to raise his heel against the carcass of the dead lion. But it is rarely either wise or instructive to treat even the errors of a really great man with mere ridicule, and in the present case the logical form of the doctrine stands on a very different footing from its substance. If species have really arisen by the operation of natural conditions, we ought to be able to find those conditions now at work. We ought to be able to discover in nature some power adequate to modify any given kind of animal or plant in such a manner as to give rise to another kind, which would be admitted by naturalists as a distinct species. Lamarck imagined that he had discovered this vera causa in the admitted facts that some organs may be modified by exercise, and that modifications, once produced, are capable of hereditary transmission. It does not seem to have occurred to him that to inquire whether there is any reason to believe that there are any limits to the amount of modification producible, or to ask how long an animal is likely to endeavour to gratify an impossible desire. The bird, in our example, would surely have renounced fish dinners long before it had produced the least effect on leg or neck. Since Lamarck's time, almost all competent naturalists have left speculations on the origin of species to such dreamers as the author of The Vestiges, by whose well-intentioned efforts the Lamarckian theory received its final condemnation in the minds of all sound thinkers. Notwithstanding this silence, however, the transmutation theory, as it has been called, has been a skeleton in the closet to many an honest zoologist and botanist who had a soul above the mere naming of dried plants and skins. Surely, has such an one thought, nature is a mighty and consistent whole, and the providential order established in the world of life must, if we could only see it rightly, be consistent with that dominant over the multiform shapes of brute matter. But what is the history of astronomy, of all the branches of physics, of chemistry, of medicine, but a narration of the steps by which the human mind has been compelled, often sorely against its will, to recognize the operation of secondary causes in events where ignorance beheld in an immediate intervention of a higher power? And in when we know that living things are formed of the same elements as the inorganic world, that they act and react upon it, bound by 1,000 ties of natural piety, is it probable, nay, is it possible, that they and they alone should have no order in their seeming disorder, no unity in their seeming multiplicity, should suffer no explanation by the discovery of some central and sublime law of mutual connection? Questions of this kind have assuredly often arisen, but it might have been long before they received such expression as would have commanded the respect and attention of the scientific world, had it not been for the publication of the work which prompted this article. Its author, Mr. Darwin, inheritor of a once celebrated name, won his spurs in science when most of those now distinguished were young men, and has for the last 20 years held a place in the front ranks of British philosophers. After a circumnavigatory voyage, undertaken solely for the love of his science, Mr. Darwin published a series of researches which at once arrested the attention of naturalists and geologists. His generalizations have since received ample confirmation, and now command universal assent. Nor is it questionable that they have had the most important influence on the progress of science. More recently, Mr. Darwin, with a versatility which is among the rarest of gifts, turned his attention to a most difficult question of zoology and minute anatomy, and no living naturalist and anatomist has published a better monograph than that which resulted from his labours. Such a man, at all events, has not entered the sanctuary with unwashed hands, and when he lays before us the results of 20 years' investigation and reflection, we must listen even though we may be disposed to strike. But in reading his work, it must be confessed that the attention which might at first be dutifully soon becomes willingly given. So clear is the author's thought, so outspoken his conviction, so honest and fair the candid expression of his doubts. Those who would judge the book must read it. We shall endeavour only to make its line of argument and its philosophical position intelligible to the general reader in our own way. The Baker Street Bazaar has just been exhibiting its familiar annual spectacle. Straight-backed, small-headed, big-barreled oxen, as dissimilar from any wild species as can well be imagined, contended for attention and praise with sheep of half a dozen different breeds, and sties of bloated, preposterous pigs, no more like a wild boar or sow than a city alderman is like an orangutan. The cattle show has been, and perhaps may again be, succeeded by a poultry show, of whose crowing and clucking prodigies it can only be certainly predicted that they will be very unlike the aboriginal Fascianus Gallus. If the seeker after animal anomalies is not satisfied, a turn or two in 7 Dials will convince him that the breeds of pigeons are quite as extraordinary and unlike one another and their parent stock, while the Horticultural Society will provide him with any number of corresponding vegetable aberrations from nature's types. He will learn, with no little surprise, too, in the course of his travels, that the proprietors and producers of these animal and vegetable anomalies regard them as distinct species, with a firm belief, the strength of which is exactly proportioned to their ignorance of scientific biology, and which is the more remarkable as they are all proud of their skill in originating such species. On careful inquiry it is found that all these, and the many other artificial breeds or races of animals and plants, have been produced by one method. The breeder, and a skilful one, must be a person of much sagacity and natural or acquired perceptive faculty, notes some slight difference, arising he knows not how, in some individuals of his stock. If he wished to perpetuate the difference, to form a breed with the peculiarity in question strongly marked, he selects such male and female individuals as exhibit the desired character, and breeds from them. Their offspring are then carefully examined, and those which exhibit the peculiarity the most distinctly are selected for breeding, and this operation is repeated until the desired amount of divergence from the primitive stock is reached. It is then found that by continuing the process of selection, always breeding, that is, from well-marked forms, and allowing no impure crosses to interfere, a race may be formed, the tendency of which to reproduce itself is exceedingly strong, nor is the limit to the amount of divergence which may be thus produced known, but one thing is certain, that if certain breeds of dog, or of pigeons, or of horses were known only in a fossil state, no naturalist would hesitate in regarding them as distinct species. But in all these cases we have human interference. Without the breeder there would be no selection, and without the selection no race. Before admitting the possibility of natural species having originated in any similar way, it must be proved that there is in nature some power which takes the place of man, and performs a selection sua sponte. It is the claim of Mr. Darwin that he professes to have discovered the existence and the modus operandi of this natural selection, as he terms it. And if he be right, the process is perfectly simple and comprehensible, and irresistibly deducible from very familiar but well-nigh forgotten facts. Who, for instance, has duly reflected upon all the consequences of the marvellous struggle for existence which is daily and hourly going on among living beings? Not only does every animal live at the expense of some other animal or plant, but the very plants are at war. The ground is full of seeds that cannot rise into seedlings. The seedlings rob one another of air, light and water, the strongest robber winning the day and extinguishing his competitors. Year after year, the wild animals with which man never interferes are, on the average, neither more nor less numerous than they were, and yet we know that the annual produce of every pair is from 1 to perhaps 1,000,000 young, so that it is mathematically certain that, on the average, as many are killed by natural causes as are born every year, and those only escape which happen to be a little better fitted to resist destruction than those which die. The individuals of a species are like the crew of a foundered ship, and none but good swimmers have a chance of reaching the land. Such being unquestionably the necessary conditions under which living creatures exist, Mr. Darwin discovers in them the instrument of natural selection. Suppose that in the midst of this incessant competition, some individuals of a species A present accidental variations which happen to fit them a little better than their fellows for the struggle in which they are engaged, then the chances are in favour not only of these individuals being better nourished than the others, but of their predominating over their fellows in other ways, and of having a better chance of leaving offspring which will, of course, tend to reproduce the peculiarities of their parents. Their offspring will, by a parity of reasoning, tend to predominate over their contemporaries, and there being, suppose, no room for more than one species such as A, the weaker variety will eventually be destroyed by the new destructive influence which is thrown into the scale, and the stronger will take its place. Surrounding conditions remaining unchanged, the new variety, which we may call B, supposed for argument's sake to be the best adapted for those conditions which can be got out of the original stock, will remain unchanged, all accidental deviations from the type becoming at once extinguished as less fit for their post than B itself. The tendency of B to persist will grow with its persistence through successive generations, and it will acquire all the characters of a new species. But, on the other hand, if the conditions of life change in any degree, however slight, B may no longer be that form which is best adapted to withstand their destructive, and profit by their sustaining, influence, in which case, if it should give rise to a more competent variety C, this will take its place and become a new species, and thus by natural selection the species B and C will be successively derived from A. That this most ingenious hypothesis enables us to give a reason for many apparent anomalies in the distribution of living beings in time and space, and that it is not contradicted by the main phenomena of life and organization, appear to us to be unquestionable, and so far it must be admitted to have an immense advantage over any of its predecessors. But it is quite another matter to affirm absolutely either the truth or falsehood of Mr. Darwin's views at the present stage of the inquiry. Goethe has an excellent aphorism defining that state of mind which he calls fatigue skepsis, active doubt. It is doubt which so loves truth that it neither dares rest in doubting nor extinguish itself by unjustified belief. And we commend this state of mind to students of species with respect to Mr. Darwin's or any other hypothesis as to their origin. The combined investigation of another 20 years may, perhaps, enable naturalists to say whether the modifying causes and the selective power, which Mr. Darwin has satisfactorily shown to exist in nature, are competent to produce all the effects he ascribes to them, or whether, on the other hand, he has been led to overestimate the value of his principle of natural selection as greatly as Lamarck overestimated his vera causa of modification by exercise. But there is, at all events, one advantage possessed by the more recent writer over his predecessor. Mr. Darwin abhors mere speculation as nature abhors a vacuum. He is as greedy of cases and precedents as any constitutional lawyer, and all the principles he lays down are capable of being brought to the test of observation and experiment. The path he bids us follow professes to be not a mere airy trick fabricated of ideal cobwebs, but a solid and broad bridge of facts. If it be so, it will carry us safely over many a chasm in our knowledge, and lead us to a region free from the snares of those fascinating but barren virgins, the final causes, against whom a high authority has so justly warned us. "My sons, dig in the vineyard," were the last words of the old man in the fable, and, though the sons found no treasure, they made their fortunes by the grapes. Huxley on the reception of the origin of species. To the present generation, that is to say the people a few years on the hither and thither side of 30, the name of Charles Darwin stands alongside of those of Isaac Newton and Michael Faraday, and, like them, calls up the grand ideal of a searcher after truth and interpreter of nature. They think of him who bore it as a rare combination of genius, industry, and unswerving veracity, who earned his place among the most famous men of the age by sheer native power, in the teeth of a gale of popular prejudice and uncheered by a sign of favour or appreciation from the official fountains of honour, as one who, in spite of an acute sensitiveness to praise and blame, and notwithstanding provocations which might have excused any outbreak, kept himself clear of all envy, hatred, and malice, nor dealt otherwise than fairly and justly with the unfairness and injustice which was showered upon him, while to the end of his days he was ready to listen with patience and respect to the most insignificant of reasonable objectors. And with respect to that theory of the origin of the forms of life peopling our globe, with which Darwin's name is bound up as closely as that of Newton with the theory of gravitation, nothing seems to be further from the mind of the present generation than any attempt to smother it with ridicule or to crush it by vehemence of denunciation. The struggle for existence and natural selection have become household words and everyday conceptions. The reality and the importance of the natural processes on which Darwin founds his deductions are no more doubted than those of growth and multiplication, and whether the full potency attributed to them is admitted or not, no one doubts their vast and far-reaching significance. Wherever the biological sciences are studied, the origin of species lights the paths of the investigator. Wherever they are taught, it permeates the course of instruction. Nor has the influence of Darwinian ideas been less profound beyond the realms of biology. The oldest of all philosophies, that of evolution, was bound hand and foot and cast into utter darkness during the millennium of theological scholasticism. But Darwin poured new lifeblood into the ancient frame. The bonds burst, and the revived thought of ancient Greece has proved itself to be a more adequate expression of the universal order of things than any of the schemes which have been accepted by the credulity and welcomed by the superstition of 70 later generations of men. To anyone who studies the signs of the times, the emergence of the philosophy of evolution in the attitude of claimant to the throne of the world of thought, from the limbo of hated and, as many hoped, forgotten things, is the most portentous event of the 19th century. But the most effective weapons of the modern champions of evolution were fabricated by Darwin, and the origin of species has enlisted a formidable body of combatants trained in the severe school of physical science, whose ears might have long remained deaf to the speculations of a priori philosophers. I do not think any candid or instructed person will deny the truth of that which has just been asserted. He may hate the very name of evolution, and may deny its pretensions as vehemently as a Jacobite denied those of George II. But there it is, not only as solidly seated as the Hanoverian dynasty, but happily independent of parliamentary sanction, and the dullest antagonists have come to see that they have to deal with an adversary whose bones are to be broken by no amount of bad words. Even the theologians have almost ceased to pit the plain meaning of Genesis against the no less plain meaning of nature. Their more candid or more cautious representatives have given up dealing with evolution as if it were a damnable heresy, and have taken refuge in one of two courses. Either they deny that Genesis was meant to teach scientific truth, and thus save the veracity of the record at the expense of its authority, or they expend their energies in devising the cruel ingenuities of the reconciler and torture texts in the vain hope of making them confess the creed of science. But when the peine forte et dure is over, the antique sincerity of the venerable sufferer always reasserts itself. Genesis is honest to the core, and professes to be no more than it is, a repository of venerable traditions of unknown origin, claiming no scientific authority and possessing none. As my pen finishes these passages, I can but be amused to think what a terrible hubbub would have been made, in truth was made, about any similar expressions of opinion a quarter of a century ago. In fact, the contrast between the present condition of public opinion upon the Darwinian question, between the estimation in which Darwin's views are now held in the scientific world, between the acquiescence, or at least quiescence, of the theologians of the self-respecting order at the present day, and the outburst of antagonism on all sides in 1858-59, when the new theory respecting the origin of species first became known to the older generation to which I belong, is so startling that, except for documentary evidence, I should be sometimes inclined to think my memories dreams. I have a great respect for the younger generation myself. They can write our lives and ravel out all our follies if they choose to take the trouble by and by, and I shall be glad to be assured that the feeling is reciprocal. But I am afraid that the story of our dealings with Darwin may prove a great hindrance to that veneration for our wisdom which I should like them to display. We have not even the excuse that 30 years ago Mr. Darwin was an obscure novice who had no claims on our attention. On the contrary, his remarkable zoological and geological investigations had long given him an assured position among the most eminent and original investigators of the day, while his charming Voyage of a Naturalist had justly earned him a widespread reputation among the general public. I doubt if there was any man then living who had a better right to expect that anything he might choose to say on such a question as the origin of species would be listened to with profound attention and discussed with respect, and there was certainly no man whose personal character should have afforded a better safeguard against attacks, instinct with malignity and spiced with shameless impertinences. Yet such was the portion of one of the kindest and truest men that it was ever my good fortune to know, and years had to pass away before misrepresentation, ridicule, and denunciation ceased to be the most notable constituents of the majority of the multitudinous criticisms of his work which poured from the press. I am loath to rake any of these ancient scandals from their well-deserved oblivion, but I must make good a statement which may seem overcharged to the present generation, and there is no piece justificative more apt for the purpose, or more worthy of such dishonour, than the article in the Quarterly Review for July 1860. I was not aware, when I wrote these passages, that the authorship of the article had been publicly acknowledged. Confession accompanied by penitence, however, affords no ground for mitigation of judgment, and the kindliness with which Mr. Darwin speaks of his assailant, Bishop Wilberforce, Volume 2, is so striking an exemplification of his singular gentleness and modesty that it rather increases one's indignation against the presumption of his critic. Since Lord Brougham assailed Dr. Young, the world has seen no such specimen of the insolence of a shallow pretender to a master in science as this remarkable production, in which one of the most exact of observers, most cautious of reasoners, and most candid of expositors of this or any other age is held up to scorn as a flighty person, who endeavours to prop up his utterly rotten fabric of guess and speculation, and whose mode of dealing with nature is reprobated as utterly dishonourable to natural science. And all this high and mighty talk, which would have been indecent in one of Mr. Darwin's equals, proceeds from a writer whose want of intelligence, or of conscience, or of both, is so great that by way of an objection to Mr. Darwin's views he can ask, "Is it credible that all favourable varieties of turnips are tending to become men?" Who is so ignorant of paleontology that he can talk of the flowers and fruits of the plants of the Carboniferous epoch, of comparative anatomy that he can gravely affirm the poison apparatus of the venomous snakes to be entirely separate from the ordinary laws of animal life and peculiar to themselves, of the rudiments of physiology that he can ask, what advantage of life could alter the shape of the corpuscles into which the blood can be evaporated? Nor does the reviewer fail to flavour this outpouring of preposterous incapacity with a little stimulation of the odium theologicum. Some inkling of the history of the conflicts between astronomy, geology, and theology leads him to keep a retreat open by the proviso that he cannot consent to test the truth of natural science by the word of revelation. But for all that, he devotes pages to the exposition of his conviction that Mr. Darwin's theory contradicts the revealed relation of the Creator to creation and is inconsistent with the fullness of his glory. If I confine my retrospect of the reception of The Origin of Species to a 12-month or thereabouts from the time of its publication, I do not recollect anything quite so foolish and unmannerly as the Quarterly Review article, unless perhaps the address of a reverend professor to the Dublin Geological Society might enter into competition with it. But a large proportion of Mr. Darwin's critics had a lamentable resemblance to the Quarterly Reviewer, in so far as they lacked either the will or the wit to make themselves masters of his doctrine. Hardly any possessed the knowledge required to follow him through the immense range of biological and geological science which The Origin covered, while, too commonly, they had prejudiced the case on theological grounds, and, as it seems to be inevitable when this happens, eked out lack of reason by superfluity of railing. But it will be more pleasant and more profitable to consider those criticisms which were acknowledged by writers of scientific authority, or which bore internal evidence of the greater or less competency, and often of the good faith of their authors. Restricting my survey to a 12-month or thereabouts after the publication of The Origin, I find among such critics Louise Agassiz, the arguments presented by Darwin in favour of a universal derivation from one primary form of all the peculiarities existing now among living beings have not made the slightest impression on my mind. Until the facts of nature are shown to have been mistaken by those who have collected them, and that they have a different meaning from that now generally assigned to them, I shall therefore consider the transmutation theory as a scientific mistake, untrue in its facts, unscientific in its methods, and mischievous in its tendency. From Silliman's Journal, July 1860, pages 143, 154. Extract from the third volume of Contributions to the Natural History of the United States. Murray, an excellent entomologist, Harvey, a botanist of considerable repute, and the author of an article in the Edinburgh Review, all strongly adverse to Darwin. Pictet, the distinguished and widely learned paleontologist of Geneva, treats Mr. Darwin with a respect which forms a grateful contrast to the tone of some of the preceding writers, but consents to go with him only a very little way. I see no serious objections to the formation of varieties by natural selection in the existing world, and that so far as earlier epochs are concerned, this law may be assumed to explain the origin of closely allied species, supposing for this purpose a very long period of time. With regard to simple varieties and closely allied species, I believe that Mr. Darwin's theory may explain many things and throw a great light upon numerous questions. Sur l'origine de l'espèce par Charles Darwin. Archives de Science de la Bibliothèque Universelle de Genève, pages 242-243, March 1860. On the other hand, Lyell, up to that time a pillar of the anti-transmutationists, who regarded him ever afterwards as Pallas Athene may have looked at Diane after the Endymion affair, declared himself a Darwinian, though not without putting in a serious caveat. Nevertheless, he was a tower of strength, and his courageous stand for truth as against consistency did him infinite honour. As evolutionists, sans phrase, I do not call to mind among biologists more than Asa Gray, who fought the battle splendidly in the United States, Hooker, who was no less vigorous here, the present Sir John Lubbock, and myself. Wallace was far away in the Malay archipelago, but apart from his direct share in the promulgation of the theory of natural selection, no enumeration of the influences at work at the time I am speaking of would be complete without the mention of his powerful essay on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species, which was published in 1855. On reading it afresh, I have been astonished to recollect how small was the impression it made. In France, the influence of Elie de Beaumont and of Fleuron, the former of whom is said to have damned himself to everlasting fame by inventing the nickname of La Science Mousante for evolutionism, one is reminded of the effect of another small academic epigram. The so-called vertebral theory of the skull is said to have been nipped in the bud in France by the whisper of an academician to his neighbour that in this case one's head was a vertèbre pensante, to say nothing of the ill will of other powerful members of the Institute, produced for a long time the effect of a conspiracy of silence. And many years passed before the Academy redeemed itself from the reproach that the name of Darwin was not to be found on the list of its members. However, an accomplished writer out of the range of academical influences, Monsieur Rogel, gave an excellent and appreciative notice of the origin in the Revue des Deux Mondes. Germany took time to consider. Bronn produced a slightly bowdlerized translation of the origin, and Kladderadatsch cut his jokes upon the ape origin of man. But I do not call to mind that any scientific notability declared himself publicly in 1860. However, the man who stands next to Darwin in his influence on modern biologists, K. E. von Baer, wrote to me in August 1860, expressing his general assent to evolutionist views. His phrase, «J'énonce les mêmes idées que Monsieur Darwin», Volume 2, is shown by his subsequent writings to mean no more than this. None of us dreamed that in the course of a few years the strength, and perhaps I may add the weakness, of Darwinismus would have its most extensive and most brilliant illustrations in the land of learning. If a foreigner may presume to speculate on the cause of this curious interval of silence, I fancy it was that one moiety of the German biologists were orthodox at any price, and the other moiety as distinctly heterodox. The latter were evolutionists, a priori, already, and they must have felt the disgust natural to deductive philosophers at being offered an inductive and experimental foundation for a conviction which they had reached by a shorter cut. It is undoubtedly trying to learn that, though your conclusions may be all right, your reasons for them are all wrong, or at any rate insufficient. On the whole, then, the supporters of Mr. Darwin's views in 1860 were numerically extremely insignificant. There is not the slightest doubt that, if a general council of the Church Scientific had been held at that time, we should have been condemned by an overwhelming majority. And there is as little doubt that, if such a council gathered now, the decree would be of an exactly contrary nature. It would indicate a lack of sense, as well as of modesty, to ascribe to the men of that generation less capacity or less honesty than their successors possess. What, then, are the causes which led instructed and fair-judging men of that day to arrive at a judgment so different from that which seems just and fair to those who follow them? That is really one of the most interesting of all questions connected with the history of science, and I shall try to answer it. I am afraid that in order to do so, I must run the risk of appearing egotistical. However, if I tell my own story, it is only because I know it better than that of other people. I think I must have read The Vestiges before I left England in 1846. But if I did, the book made very little impression upon me, and I was not brought into serious contact with the species question until after 1850. At that time I had long done with the Pentateuchal cosmogony, which had been impressed upon my childish understanding as divine truth, with all the authority of parents and instructors, and from which it had cost me many a struggle to get free. But my mind was unbiased in respect of any doctrine which presented itself, if it professed to be based on purely philosophical and scientific reasoning. It seemed to me then, as it does now, that creation, in the ordinary sense of the word, is perfectly conceivable. I find no difficulty in imagining that at some former period this universe was not in existence, and that it made its appearance in 6 days, or instantaneously, if that is preferred, in consequence of the volition of some pre-existent being. Then, as now, the so-called a priori arguments against theism, and, given a deity, against the possibility of creative acts, appeared to me to be devoid of reasonable foundation. I had not then, and I have not now, the smallest a priori objection to raise to the account of the creation of animals and plants given in Paradise Lost, in which Milton so vividly embodies the natural sense of Genesis. Far be it from me to say that it is untrue because it is impossible. I confine myself to what must be regarded as a modest and reasonable request for some particle of evidence that the existing species of animals and plants did originate in that way, as a condition of my belief in a statement which appears to me to be highly improbable. And, by way of being perfectly fair, I had exactly the same answer to give to the evolutionists of 1851-58. Within the ranks of the biologists at that time, I met with nobody, except Dr. Grant of University College, who had a word to say for evolution, and his advocacy was not calculated to advance the cause. Outside these ranks, the only person known to me whose knowledge and capacity compelled respect, and who was at the same time a thoroughgoing evolutionist, was Mr. Herbert Spencer, whose acquaintance I made, I think, in 1852, and then entered into the bonds of a friendship which I am happy to think has known no interruption. Many and prolonged were the battles we fought on this topic, but even my friend's rare dialectic skill and copiousness of apt illustration could not drive me from my agnostic position. I took my stand upon 2 grounds. Firstly, that up to that time the evidence in favour of transmutation was wholly insufficient, and secondly, that no suggestion respecting the causes of transmutation assumed, which had been made, was in any way adequate to explain the phenomena. Looking back at the state of knowledge at that time, I really do not see that any other conclusion was justifiable. In those days I had never even heard of Treviranus biology. However, I had studied Lamarck attentively, and I had read the Vestiges with due care, but neither of them afforded me any good ground for changing my negative and critical attitude. As for the Vestiges, I confess that the book simply irritated me by the prodigious ignorance and thoroughly unscientific habit of mind manifested by the writer. If it had any influence on me at all, it set me against evolution, and the only review I ever had qualms of conscience about, on the ground of needless savagery, is one I wrote on the Vestiges while under that influence. With respect to the philosophie zoologique, it is no reproach to Lamarck to say that the discussion of the species question in that work, whatever might be said for it in 1809, was miserably below the level of the knowledge of half a century later. In that interval of time, the elucidation of the structure of the lower animals and plants had given rise to wholly new conceptions of their relations. Histology and embryology, in the modern sense, had been created. Physiology had been reconstituted. The facts of distribution, geological and geographical, had been prodigiously multiplied and reduced to order. To any biologist whose studies had carried him beyond mere species-mongering in 1850, one half of Lamarck's arguments were obsolete and the other half erroneous or defective, in virtue of omitting to deal with the various classes of evidence which had been brought to light since his time. Moreover, his one suggestion as to the cause of the gradual modification of species, effort excited by change of conditions, was, on the face of it, inapplicable to the whole vegetable world. I do not think that any impartial judge who reads the Philosophie zoologique now, and who afterwards takes up Lyell's trenchant and effectual criticism, published as far back as 1830, will be disposed to allot to Lamarck a much higher place in the establishment of biological evolution than that which Bacon assigns to himself in relation to physical science generally, buccinata tantum. Erasmus Darwin first promulgated Lamarck's fundamental conceptions, and with greater logical consistency he had applied them to plants, but the advocates of his claims have failed to show that he, in any respect, anticipated the central idea of the origin of species. But, by a curious irony of fate, the same influence which led me to put as little faith in modern speculations on this subject as in the venerable traditions recorded in the first 2 chapters of Genesis was perhaps more potent than any other in keeping alive a sort of pious conviction that evolution, after all, would turn out true. I have recently read afresh the first edition of The Principles of Geology, and when I consider that this remarkable book had been nearly 30 years in everybody's hands, and that it brings home to any reader of ordinary intelligence a great principle and a great fact, the principle that the past must be explained by the present, unless good cause be shown to the contrary, and the fact that, so far as our knowledge of the past history of life on our globe goes, no such cause can be shown, the same principle and the same fact guide the result from all sound historical investigations. Grote's History of Greece is a product of the same intellectual movement as Lyell's principles. I cannot but believe that Lyell, for others as for myself, was the chief agent for smoothing the road for Darwin. For consistent uniformitarianism postulates evolution as much in the organic as in the inorganic world. The origin of a new species by other than ordinary agencies would be a vastly greater catastrophe than any of those which Lyell successfully eliminated from sober geological speculation. In fact, no one was better aware of this than Lyell himself. Lyell, with perfect right, claims this position for himself. He speaks of having advocated a law of continuity even in the organic world, as far as possible without adopting Lamarck's theory of transmutation. But while I taught that as often as certain forms of animals and plants disappeared, for reasons quite intelligible to us, others took their place by virtue of a causation which was beyond our comprehension. It remained for Darwin to accumulate proof that there is no break between the incoming and the outgoing species, that they are the work of evolution and not of special creation. I had certainly prepared the way in this country in 6 editions of my work before the Vestiges of Creation appeared in 1842, for the reception of Darwin's gradual and insensible evolution of species. From Life and Letters, Letter to Haeckel, Volume 2, page 436, November the 23rd, 1868. If one reads any of the early editions of the Principles carefully, especially by the light of the interesting series of letters recently published by Sir Charles Lyell's biographer, it is easy to see that, with all his energetic opposition to Lamarck on the one hand, and to the ideal quasi-progressionism of Agassiz on the other, Lyell, in his own mind, was strongly disposed to account for the origination of all past and present species of living things by natural causes, but he would have liked, at the same time, to keep the name of creation for a natural process which he imagined to be incomprehensible. In a letter addressed to Mantell, dated March 2nd, 1827, Lyell speaks of having just read Lamarck. He expresses his delight at Lamarck's theories and his personal freedom from any objection based on theological grounds. And though he is evidently alarmed at the pithcoid origin of man involved in Lamarck's doctrine, he observes, "But, after all, what changes species may really undergo? How impossible will it be to distinguish and lay down a line beyond which some of the so-called extinct species have never passed into recent ones?" Again, the following remarkable passage occurs in the postscripts of a letter addressed to Sir John Herschel in 1836. "In regard to the origination of new species, I am very glad to find that you think it probable that it may be carried on through the intervention of intermediate causes. I left this rather to be inferred, not thinking it worthwhile to offend a certain class of persons by embodying in words what would only be speculation." In the same sense, see the letter to Whewell, March the 7th, 1837, Volume 2, page 5. In regard to this last subject, the changes from one set of animal and vegetable species to another, you remember what Herschel said in his letter to me. If I had stated as plainly as he has done the possibility of the introduction or origination of fresh species being a natural, in contradistinction to a miraculous process, I should have raised a host of prejudices against me, which are unfortunately opposed at every step to any philosopher who attempts to address the public on these mysterious subjects. See also letter to Sedgwick, January the 12th, 1838, Part 2, page 35. He goes on to refer to the criticisms which have been directed against him on the ground that, by leaving species to be originated by miracle, he is inconsistent with his own doctrine of uniformitarianism, and he leaves it to be understood that he had not replied on the ground of his general objection to controversy. Lyell's contemporaries were not without some inkling of his esoteric doctrine. Whewell's History of the Inductive Sciences, whatever its philosophical value, is always worth reading and always interesting, if under no other aspect than that of an evidence of the speculative limits within which a highly placed divine might at that time safely range at will. In the course of his discussion of uniformitarianism, the encyclopedic Master of Trinity observes, "Mr. Lyell indeed has spoken of an hypothesis that the successive creation of species may constitute a regular part of the economy of nature, but he has nowhere, I think, so described this process as to make it appear in what department of science we are to place the hypothesis. Are these new species created by the production at long intervals of an offspring different in species from the parents, or are the species so created produced without parents? Are they gradually evolved from some embryo substance, or do they suddenly start from the ground as in the creation of the poet? Some selection of one of these forms of the hypothesis rather than the others, with evidence for the selection, is requisite to entitle us to place it among the known causes of change which in this chapter we are considering. The bare conviction that a creation of species has taken place, whether once or many times, so long as it is unconnected with our organical sciences, is a tenet of natural theology rather than of physical philosophy." Whewell's History, Volume 3, page 639 to 640, Edition 2, 1847. The earlier part of this criticism appears perfectly just and appropriate, but from the concluding paragraph, Whewell evidently imagines that by creation Lyell means a preternatural intervention of the deity, whereas the letter to Herschel shows that in his own mind Lyell meant natural causation, and I see no reason to doubt (brackets). The following passages in Lyell's letters appear to me decisive on this point. To Darwin, October 3rd, 1859, Part 2, 325. On first reading The Origin, I have long seen most clearly that if any concession is made, all that you claim in your concluding pages will follow. It is this which has made me so long hesitate, always feeling that the case of man and his races, and of other animals, and that of plants is one and the same, and that if a vera causa be admitted for one instant, instead of a purely unknown and imaginary one, such as the word creation, all the consequences must follow. To Darwin, March 15th, 1863, Volume 2, page 365. I remember that it was the conclusion that he, Lamarck, came to about man that fortified me 30 years ago against the great impression which his arguments at first made on my mind, all the greater because Constant Prévost, a pupil of Cuvier's 40 years ago, told me his conviction that Cuvier thought species not real, but that science could not advance without assuming that they were so. To Hooker, March 9th, 1863, Volume 2, page 361. In reference to Darwin's feeling about the antiquity of man, he, Darwin, seems much disappointed that I do not go farther with him, or do not speak out more. I can only say that I have spoken out to the full extent of my present convictions, and even beyond my state of feeling as to man's unbroken descent from the brutes, and I find I am half converting not a few who were in arms against Darwin, and are even now against Huxley. He speaks of having had to abandon old and long-cherished ideas, which constituted the charm to me of the theoretical part of the science in my earlier day, when I believed with Pascal in the theory, as Hallam terms it, of the archangel ruined. See the same sentiment in the letter to Darwin, March 11th, 1863, page 363. I think the old creation is almost as much required as ever, but of course it takes a new form if Lamarck's views improved by yours are adopted. Close brackets. That if Sir Charles could have avoided the inevitable corollary of the pithecoid origin of man, for which to the end of his life he entertained a profound antipathy, he would have advocated the efficiency of causes now in operation to bring about the condition of the organic world as stoutly as he championed that doctrine in reference to inorganic nature. The fact is that a discerning eye might have seen that some form or other of the doctrine of transmutation was inevitable from the time when the truth enunciated by William Smith, that successive strata are characterized by different kinds of fossil remains, became a firmly established law of nature. No one has set forth the speculative consequences of this generalization better than the historian of the inductive sciences. Quote, "But the study of geology opens to us the spectacle of many groups of species which have, in the course of the earth's history, succeeded each other at vast intervals of time, one set of animals and plants disappearing, as it would seem, from the face of our planet, and others which did not before exist becoming the only occupants of the globe. And the dilemma then presents itself to us anew. Either we must accept the doctrine of transmutation of species, and must suppose that the organized species of one geological epoch were transmuted into those of another by some long-continued agency of natural causes, or else we must believe in many successive acts of creation and extinction of species out of the common course of nature, acts which therefore we may properly call miraculous." Whewell's History of the Inductive Sciences, Edition 2, 1847, Volume 3, pages 624, 625. See for the author's verdict, pages 638 and 39. Dr. Whewell decides in favour of the latter conclusion, and if anyone had plied him with the 4 questions which he puts to Lyell in the passage already cited, all that can be said now is that he would certainly have rejected the first. But would he really have had the courage to say that a Rhinoceros ticarinus, for instance, was produced without parents, or was evolved from some embryo substance, or that it suddenly started from the ground like Milton's lion pawing to get free his hinder parts. I permit myself no doubt whether even the master of Trinity's well-tried courage, physical, intellectual and moral, would have been equal to this feat. No doubt the sudden concurrence of 1/2 a ton of inorganic molecules into a live rhinoceros is conceivable, and therefore may be possible. But does such an event lie sufficiently within the bounds of probability to justify the belief in its occurrence on the strength of any attainable, or indeed imaginable, evidence? In view of the assertion, often repeated in the early days of the opposition to Darwin, that he had added nothing to Lamarck, it is very interesting to observe that the possibility of a fifth alternative, in addition to the 4 he has stated, has not dawned upon Dr. Whewell's mind. The suggestion that new species may result from the selective action of external conditions upon the variations from their specific type which individuals present, and which we call spontaneous because we are ignorant of their causation, is as wholly unknown to the historian of scientific ideas as it was to biological specialists before 1858. But that suggestion is the central idea of the origin of species, and contains the quintessence of Darwinism. Thus, looking back into the past, it seems to me that my own position of critical expectancy was just and reasonable, and must have been taken up, on the same grounds, by many other persons. If Agassiz told me that the forms of life which had successively tenanted the globe were the incarnations of successive thoughts of the deity, and that he had wiped out one set of these embodiments by an appalling geological catastrophe as soon as his ideas took a more advanced shape, I found myself not only unable to admit the accuracy of the deductions from the facts of paleontology upon which this astounding hypothesis was founded, but I had to confess my want of any means of testing the correctness of his explanation of them. And besides that, I could by no means see what the explanation explained. Neither did it help me to be told by an eminent anatomist that species had succeeded one another in time in virtue of a continuously operative creational law. That seemed to me to be no more than saying that species had succeeded one another in the form of vote-catching resolution, with law to please the man of science and creational to draw the orthodox. So I took refuge in that Thatija skepsis, which Goethe has so well defined, and reversing the apostolic precept to be all things to all men, I usually defended the tenability of the received doctrines when I had to do with transmutationists, and stood up for the possibility of transmutation among the orthodox, thereby, no doubt, increasing an already current but quite undeserved reputation for needless combativeness. I remember, in the course of my first interview with Mr. Darwin, expressing my belief in the sharpness of the lines of demarcation between natural groups and in the absence of transitional forms, with all the confidence of youth and imperfect knowledge. I was not aware at that time that he had then been many years brooding over the species question, and the humorous smile which accompanied his gentle answer, that such was not altogether his view, long haunted and puzzled me. But it would seem that 4 or 5 years' hard work had enabled me to understand what it meant. For Lyell, Life and Letters, Volume 2, page 212, writing to Sir George Bunbury, under date of April 30th, 1856, says, "When Huxley, Hooker and Wollaston were at Darwin's last week, they, all 4 of them, ran a tilt against species, further, I believe, than they are prepared to go." I recollect nothing of this beyond the fact of meeting Mr. Wollaston, and except for Sir Charles' distinct assurance as to all 4, I should have thought my outrecudence was probably a counterblast to Wollaston's conservatism. With regard to Hooker, he was already, like Voltaire's Habakkuk, capable de tout in the way of advocating evolution. As I have already said, I imagine that most of those of my contemporaries who thought seriously about the matter were very much in my own state of mind, inclined to say to both mosaists and evolutionists, "A plague on both your houses," and disposed to turn aside from interminable and apparently fruitless discussion to labour in the fertile fields of ascertainable fact. And I may, therefore, further suppose that the publication of the Darwin and Wallace papers in 1858, and still more that of the Origin in 1859, had the effect upon them of the flash of light, which to a man who has lost himself in a dark night suddenly reveals a road which, whether it takes him straight home or not, certainly goes his way. That which we were looking for, and could not find, was a hypothesis respecting the origin of known organic forms, which assumed the operation of no causes but such as could be proved to be actually at work. We wanted not to pin our faith to that or any other speculation, but to get hold of clear and definite conceptions which could be brought face to face with facts and have their validity tested. The Origin provided us with the working hypothesis we sought. Moreover, it did the immense service of freeing us forever from the dilemma: refuse to accept the creation hypothesis, and what have you to propose that can be accepted by any cautious reasoner? In 1857 I had no answer ready, and I do not think that any one else had. A year later we reproached ourselves with dullness for being perplexed by such an inquiry. My reflection, when I first made myself master of the central idea of the Origin, was, how extremely stupid not to have thought of that. I suppose that Columbus' companion said much the same when he made the egg stand on end. The facts of variability, of the struggle for existence, of adaptation to conditions, were notorious enough, but none of us had suspected that the road to the heart of the species problem lay through them, until Darwin and Wallace dispelled the darkness, and the beacon fire of the Origin guided the benighted. Whether the particular shape which the doctrine of evolution as applied to the organic world took in Darwin's hands would prove to be final or not was to me a matter of indifference. In my earliest criticisms of the Origin, I ventured to point out that its logical foundation was insecure so long as experiments in selective breeding had not produced varieties which were more or less infertile, and that insecurity remains up to the present time. But with any and every critical doubt which my sceptical ingenuity could suggest, the Darwinian hypothesis remained incomparably more probable than the creation hypothesis. And if we had none of us been able to discern the paramount significance of some of the most patent and notorious of natural facts, until they were, so to speak, thrust under our noses, what force remained in the dilemma, creation or nothing? It was obvious that, hereafter, the probability would be immensely greater that the links of natural causation were hidden from our purblind eyes than that natural causation should be incompetent to produce all the phenomena of nature. The only rational course for those who had no other object than the attainment of truth was to accept Darwinism as a working hypothesis and see what could be made of it. Either it would prove its capacity to elucidate the facts of organic life, or it would break down under the strain. This was surely the dictate of common sense, and for once common sense carried the day. The result has been that complete volte-face of the whole scientific world, which must seem so surprising to the present generation. I do not mean to say that all the leaders of biological science have avowed themselves Darwinians, but I do not think that there is a single zoologist, a botanist, or paleontologist among the multitude of active workers of this generation who is other than an evolutionist profoundly influenced by Darwin's views. Whatever may be the ultimate fate of the particular theory put forth by Darwin, I venture to affirm that, so far as my knowledge goes, all the ingenuity and all the learning of hostile critics have not enabled them to adduce a solitary fact of which it can be said, this is irreconcilable with Darwinian theory. In the prodigious variety and complexity of organic nature, There are multitudes of phenomena which are not deducible from any generalizations we have yet reached, but the same may be said of every other class of natural objects. I believe that astronomers cannot yet get the moon's motions into perfect accordance with the theory of gravitation. It would be inappropriate, even if it were possible, to discuss the difficulties and unresolved problems which have hitherto met the evolutionist, and which will probably continue to puzzle him for generations to come in the course of this brief history of the reception of Mr. Darwin's great work. But there are 2 or 3 objections of more general character, based, or supposed to be based, upon philosophical and theological foundations, which were loudly expressed in the early days of the Darwinian controversy, and which, though they have been answered over and over again, crop up now and then to the present day. The most singular of these, perhaps immortal fallacies, which live on, Tithonus-like, when sense and force have long deserted them, is that which charges Mr. Darwin with having attempted to reinstate the old pagan goddess Chance. It is said that he supposes variations to come about by chance, and that the fittest survive the chances of the struggle for existence, and thus chance is substituted for providential design. It is not a little wonderful that such an accusation as this should be brought against a writer who has, over and over again, warned his readers that when he uses the word spontaneous, he merely means that he is ignorant of the cause of that which is so termed, and whose whole theory crumbles to pieces if the uniformity and regularity of natural causation for illimitable past ages is denied. But probably the best answer to those who talk of Darwinism, meaning the reign of chance, is to ask them what they themselves understand by chance. Do they believe that anything in this universe happens without reason or without a cause? Do they really conceive that any event has no cause and could not have been predicted by anyone who had a sufficient insight into the order of nature? If they do, it is they who are the inheritants of antique superstition and ignorance, and whose minds have never been illumined by a ray of scientific thought. The one act of faith in the convert to science is the confession of the universality of order, and of the absolute validity in all times and under all circumstances of the law of causation. This confession is an act of faith because, by the nature of the case, the truth of such propositions is not susceptible of proof. But such faith is not blind, but reasonable, because it is invariably confirmed by experience and constitutes the sole trustworthy foundation for all action. If one of these people, in whom the chance worship of our remoter ancestors thus strangely survives, should be within reach of the sea when a heavy gale is blowing, let him betake himself to the shore and watch the scene. Let him note the infinite variety of form and size of the tossing waves out at the sea, or of the curves of their foam-crested breakers as they dash against the rocks. Let him listen to the roar and scream of the shingles as it is cast up and torn down the beach, or look at the flakes of foam as they drive hither and thither before the wind, or note the play of colours, which answers a gleam of sunshine as it falls upon the myriad bubbles. Surely here, if anywhere, he will say that chance is supreme, and bends the knee as one who has entered the very penetralia of his divinity. But the man of science knows that here, as everywhere, perfect order is manifested, that there is not a curve of the wave, not a note on the howling chorus, not a rainbow glint on a bubble, which is other than a necessary consequence of the ascertained laws of nature, and that with a sufficient knowledge of the conditions, competent physico-mathematical skill could account for, and indeed predict, every one of these chance events. A second very common objection to Mr. Darwin's views was, and is, that they abolish teleology and eviscerate the argument from design. It is nearly 20 years since I ventured to offer some remarks on this subject, and as my arguments have as yet received no refutation, I hope I may be excused for reproducing them. I observed that the doctrine of evolution is the most formidable opponent of all the commoner and coarser forms of teleology. but perhaps the most remarkable service to the philosophy of biology rendered by Mr. Darwin is the reconciliation of teleology and morphology, and the explanation of the facts of both which his views offer. The teleology, which supposes that the eye, such as we see it in man, or one of the higher vertebrata, was made with the precise structure it exhibits for the purpose of enabling the animal which possesses it to see, has undoubtedly received its death blow. Nevertheless, it is necessary to remember that there is a wider teleology which is not touched by the doctrine of evolution, but is actually based upon the fundamental proposition of evolution. This proposition is that the whole world, living and not living, is the result of the mutual interaction according to the definite laws of the forces, I should now like to substitute the word power for forces, possessed by the molecules of which the primitive nebulosity of the universe was composed. If this be true, it is no less certain that the existing world lay potentially in the cosmic vapour, and that a sufficient intelligence could, from a knowledge of the properties of the molecules of that vapour, have predicted, say, the state of the fauna of Britain in 1869, with as much certainty as one can say what will happen to the vapour of the breath on a cold winter's day. The teleological and the mechanical views of nature are not necessarily mutually exclusive. On the contrary, the more purely a mechanist the speculator is, the more firmly does he assume a primordial molecular arrangement of which all the phenomena of the universe are the consequences, and the more completely is he thereby at the mercy of the teleologist, who can always defy him to disprove that his primordial molecular arrangement was not intended to evolve the phenomena of the universe. From the Genealogy of Animals, the Academy, 1869, reprinted in Critiques and Addresses. The acute champion of teleology, Paley, saw no difficulty in admitting that the production of things may be the result of trains of mechanical dispositions fixed beforehand by intelligent appointment and kept in action by a power at the centre. Natural Theology, chapter 23. That is to say, he proleptically accepted the modern doctrine of evolution, and his successors might do well to follow their leader, or at any rate to attend to his weighty reasonings before rushing into an antagonism which has no reasonable foundation. Having got rid of the belief in chance and the disbelief in design, as in no sense appurtenances of evolution, the third libel upon that doctrine, that it is antitheistic, might perhaps be left to shift for itself. But the persistence with which many people refuse to draw the plainest consequences from the propositions they profess to accept renders it advisable to remark that the doctrine of evolution is neither antitheistic nor theistic. It simply has no more to do with theism than the first book of Euclid has. It is quite certain that a normal, fresh-laid egg contains neither cock nor hen, and it is also as certain as any proposition in physics or morals that if such an egg is kept under proper conditions for 3 weeks, a cock or hen chicken will be found in it. It is also quite certain that if the shell were transparent, we should be able to watch the formation of the young fowl day by day by a process of evolution, from a microscopic cellular germ to its full size and complication of structure. Therefore, evolution, in the strictest sense, is actually going on in this and analogous millions and millions of instances, wherever living creatures exist. Therefore, to borrow an argument from Butler, as that which now happens must be consistent with the attributes of the deity, if such a being exists, evolution must be consistent with those attributes. And if so, the evolution of the universe, which is neither more or less explicable than that of a chicken, must also be consistent with them. The doctrine of evolution, therefore, does not even come into contact with theism, considered as a philosophical doctrine. That with which it does collide, and with which it is absolutely inconsistent, is the conception of creation, which theological speculators have based upon the history narrated in the opening of the book of Genesis. There is a great deal of talk and not a little lamentation about the so-called religious difficulties which physical science has created. In theological science, as a matter of fact, it has created none. Not a solitary problem presents itself to the philosophical theist at the present day which has not existed from the time that philosophers began to think out the logical grounds and the logical consequences of theism. All the real or imaginary perplexities which flow from the conception of the universe as a determinate mechanism are equally involved in the assumption of an eternal, omnipotent and omniscient deity. The theological equivalent of the scientific conception of order is providence, and the doctrine of determinism follows as surely from the attributes of foreknowledge assumed by the theologian as from the universality of natural causation assumed by the man of science. The angels in Paradise Lost would have found the task of enlightening Adam upon the mysteries of fate, foreknowledge and free will not a whit more difficult if their pupil had been educated in a real schule and trained in every laboratory of a modern university. In respect of the great problems of philosophy, the post-Darwinian generation is, in one sense, exactly where the pre-Darwinian generations were. They remain insoluble. But the present generation has the advantage of being better provided with the means of freeing itself from the tyranny of certain sham solutions. The known is finite, the unknown infinite. Intellectually, we stand on an islet in the midst of an illimitable ocean of inexplicability. Our business in every generation is to reclaim a little more land, to add something to the extent and the solidity of our possessions. And even a cursory glance at the history of the biological sciences during the last quarter of a century is sufficient to justify the assertion that the most potent instrument for the extension of the realm of natural knowledge which has come into men's hands since the publication of Newton's Principia is Darwin's Origin of Species. It was badly received by the generation to which it was first addressed, and the outpouring of angry nonsense to which it gave rise is sad to think upon. But the present generation will probably behave just as badly if another Darwin should arise, and inflict upon them that which the generality of mankind most hate, the necessity of revising their convictions. Let them then be charitable to us ancients, and if they behave no better than the men of my day to some new benefactor, let them recollect that, after all, our wrath did not come to much, and vented itself chiefly in the bad language of sanctimonious scolds. Let them as speedily perform a strategic right-about-face and follow the truth wherever it leads. The opponents of the new truth will discover, as those of Darwin are doing, that, after all, theories do not alter facts, and that the universe remains unaffected even though texts crumble. Or it may be that, as history repeats itself, their happy ingenuity will also discover that the new wine is exactly of the same vintage as the old, and that, rightly viewed, the old bottles prove to have been expressly made for holding it.